So we've made Kong bigger. It's a fair fight now, right? Well, Godzilla's got armor plating and the atomic breath and the tail, so he's basically got an extra fighting appendage. So, what if we gave Kong an axe? So my apologies to anybody who looks forward to my more fabulous looks, but honestly, it's not worth getting done up for this movie. Godzilla versus Kong. There will be spoilers later down the line. I will give you a heads up before we get there. But let's start broad strokes. This is probably the monsterverse movie I like the least. If I were going to rank the whole thing up to this point, Kong Skull Island, and none of these are without reservation, to be clear. Kong Skull Island would be at the top, Godzilla King of the Monsters, Godzilla 2014, and this at the bottom. The issue, honestly, is the clash of tones, because this does legitimately try to be a sequel to both Godzilla King of the Monsters and Kong Skull Island. If I were to say which one it was more, strictly in terms of how much runtime is dedicated to it, I would say it's slightly more a sequel to Kong Skull Island than it is Godzilla, and certainly Kong gets a heck of a lot more characterization and humanizing than Godzilla ever does, though I'm not sure humanizing Godzilla would have been a good idea anyway. But my point is, this feels like it is trying to marry two franchises that actually, as they've been built, don't blend that great. So here's the thing. The reason I like Kong Skull Island the most is because it was the one most willing to be at least a little bit silly and seemed to be aware that it was a little bit silly. Now, it still treated things with a fair amount of seriousness, especially when it came to the violence and the death of characters and all of that. Godzilla, both 2014 and King of the Monsters, by contrast, has treated things with a much more doom and gloom, this is all very serious sort of tone, which, while not my preference, is a valid way to depict these events and these kinds of films. It's, again, not what I prefer. I like at least a dose of silly because the concepts are inherently silly. But they opted not to do that with the Godzilla movies, and that's fine. The problem is here, we now have a clashing of tones because the overall tone of the thing is Godzilla's dour doom and gloom, like things are screwed, the human race is not going to make it kind of tone, clashing with, frankly, stuff that it's too silly for. Because a lot of the plot feels much more at home with Kong, which makes sense because he takes up more time. So, like, it's picking up on things like the Hollow Earth theory and a lot of the stuff that goes on that end of things. I won't get into specifics till I hit spoilers. A lot of that stuff fits pretty decently with Kong Skull Island. I mean, it's a little sillier. It's scaled up silly. But that doesn't really fit at all with Godzilla. And the level of ridiculousness combined with how po-faced the whole thing is, it just didn't blend for me. And the cast of characters, the human cast of characters, doesn't do a lot to help. There's a very odd mixing and matching in terms of who gets brought back and more, at least from my estimation, more glaringly, who doesn't. So they bring back Millie Bobby Brown and also the guy who plays her dad, but he's a glorified extra in this. So they bring her back, but her involvement in the plot, honestly, it's incredibly coincidental because she just happens to already be located in the one place where she could be to find the one person that would actually get her roped into things so that she would physically get involved and be in the right place for stuff to happen. It all kicks off on a massive coincidence, which can be fairly standard, but generally I find it's easier to get away with these massive coincidences in a sillier film than a more serious one. And because the overall tone of this, again, is a little bit more in line with Godzilla than with King Kong, despite the fact that plot-wise it's more Kong, then, that massive coincidence that gets her involved, another thing is, was it worth it? is it worth putting up with the massive coincidence that gets her involved in order to have her involved? And not really. She's not a detriment, but her presence doesn't add anything except a little bit of continuity and a couple of people pointing out that she was involved with previous films. But the fact that she was involved in previous films actually brings nothing particular to the table. But I said more glaringly, there's who they didn't bring back. And that, for me, really stuck out. Because, as I said, they reintroduced this Hollow Earth concept, which came up in Kong Skull Island. Now, in Kong Skull Island, they had a character who was an academic who'd been laughed at for that theory, who got a lot of confirmation from being on Skull Island, and who was brought back as an older actor, Joe Morton in this case, in Godzilla, King of the Monsters, reiterating he is still around. And this story does have a use and a requirement for an academic with an interest in Hollow Earth. Did they bring him back? No. No, they introduce a brand new, blandly attractive white guy. Why? Why not just bring back Joe Morton and have him play that same character? I cannot think of any reason other than just, we can't have an older black guy be the lead. We just can't. Well, screw you. Yeah, you could. There's, like, all due respect to Alexander Skarsgård, he brings nothing. And the presence of his character when there was an existing character who perfectly fit the mold of what he actually has to do. Yeah, no, I actually kind of took offense at that. And I am going to start getting into more specifics. But before I do, let me say, I'm not going to say there's no fun to be had. Some of the spectacle of it is, in fact, kind of spectacular. I don't feel like Adam Wingard, I think I'm pronouncing that right, handles the sense of scale as well as the previous directors in this franchise have. The monsters don't feel as big, and he's also very fond of the swishy camera, kind of, fancy shots where the camera, a monster falls and the camera goes with the monster and like loops back around him. It's too much. It's not necessary. It doesn't really add all that much, but there's fun to be had in elements of the raw experience, but it's got a script written for a silly movie, but it's taking itself as seriously as the two previous Godzilla movies did. It's a clash of tone. The characters aren't all that interesting. And I didn't have as much fun. There's some fun, but I didn't have that much. I am going to start getting into spoilers now so I can bitch about more specific things. So, that's your spoiler warning. So, right off the bat, when we introduce Kong, who is looking a little bit older, which, from a visual standpoint, I kind of appreciate that he looks a little older, looks a little weathered. He's on his island, and it opens with this actually very strange, and again, kind of silly, but when we say with Kong, the silly works a bit better, thing where it's like we're watching his morning routine and there's a song playing and then we find out the song's actually playing and it's like maybe supposed to soothe him, and there's this girl there with like a Kong doll and he's like, they have a connection somehow. Now initially I got a little bit excited because I'm like, ooh, are we going to reestablish the natives on this island and like give them some agency and a little bit of justice and characterize them? And then immediately finding out like, oh, seems to be the daughter of this other woman. I'm like, oh no, we're definitely not doing that now. But then to find out later, no, she actually is from the tribe, but she's the last survivor and basically bears no hallmarks other than like a thing on her head and a necklace to indicate that she was ever part of this and she was ever a native to this island. All the markers that would indicate and give weight to this civilization that was there that really didn't bring much and was a little bit in Kong Skull Island. I talked about that in my review. But, I thought maybe this was a chance to make amends and like really give her agency. But the fact that she is a native of that island has basically zero to do with anything. Because they claim it's like Kong bonds with her because like he's a protector of the people who were on the island, except that honestly, they could have just had any child. And like I said, bears none of the markers. She's using American Sign Language for crying out loud. So for all intents and purposes, she could have just been the biological daughter of the woman who has basically adopted her, as far as the plot goes. So that was annoying. Part of my frustration is they had a lot of pieces to work with that they just don't. And then the things they choose to work with are I'm not sure they were worth reusing. So we get a follow-up on the post-credit scene from Godzilla King of the Monsters, which was the head of Ghidorah falling into the hands of Charles Dance. Sadly, Charles Dance does not come back, but apparently he sold it to the obviously evil mega corporation, which, again, still brings up the problem that I had with that post-credit scene. There's my review for Godzilla King of the Monsters where I got into that. But long story short, the fact that he collected that thing didn't fit with the motivations he was given in that film. And now I guess we're supposed to just assume he sold it for money. But he was part of a plan in that movie to basically wipe out a huge chunk of humanity, which would have disrupted society and economies. Like, why would someone who had that as their stated and actions indicated it in fact was their goal, why would they want money? What? I mean, that's my hang up, because it actually doesn't come into play. All it matters is it's now in the hands of Apex Cybernetics, the totally kosher sounding, like, that's another thing that I mean. It is so stupefyingly obvious that Apex are going to be the villains, and the movie seems to know that. It doesn't try and hide it. It doesn't try to play it as a twist, even though in universe, in story, some characters get surprised by this, like, oh, look at that. We went on this expedition funded by Apex, and the person associated with Apex, who has been grouchy and confrontational the whole time, betrayed us for the resources. Who could have foreseen this coming? Apparently not the characters. The movie does seem to assume that the audience knows, so it's not insulting, but again, it speaks to that clash of tone, because this is a cartoonishly evil corporation in terms of what they're doing, the means they're using to do it, the lengths they're prepared to go to. It is Umbrella Corporation's level of what the hell. And honestly, I think the only time any film has ever gotten away with that was really the original Alien, but it was because the idea of a corporation as cold-hearted as Weyland-Yutani wasn't a ubiquitous cultural staple yet. It was a newer idea in 1979. It's not now. But it's a silly idea, and it can work in a sillier movie. But again, the overall tone of this thing is too serious for me to take it seriously, because you're doing cartoonish villainy. And I'm not even going to cite specific examples, but the dialogue sucks. Dialogue blows in this thing. And I'm not sure the dialogue had been that good in the previous movies, but they found some actors here and there who could make it feel more lively. Honestly, in Kong Skull Island, they had a lot of them. Samuel L. Jackson, John Goodman, Brie Larson, John C. Reilly, especially, Tom Hiddleston. They were able to bring some life to what otherwise might have been some kind of dumb dialogue. And even in Godzilla King of the Monsters, you have people like Bradley Whitford really livening things up and doing banter so rapid fire that it feels fun, even though the information being conveyed is, it's exposition 90% of the time. Here, all these actors, honestly, they're too bland. They're too bland, and or they're playing such arch characters that there's no nuance, there's no bounce, and every time characters start talking, I'm just kind of like, there was one. I'm just rambling at this point. There was one kind of nifty little subversion that I did like until they got to the point of how they resolved it, and then I was like, oh, for God's sake. So they have this thing. So I told you there were going to be spoilers. Mechagodzilla is in the finale, which I half called. I didn't call Mechagodzilla specifically, but I did call in my Godzilla King of the Monsters review that ultimately Kong and Godzilla were going to team up against a third threat. And I also said it would be the lazy option. And look, they did it. So Mechagodzilla shows up and is being the little trio of Millie Bobby Brown and this paranoid podcaster and Millie Bobby Brown's friend. He was actually good. He made some of the dialogue work. So I'll put his name down here because I can't remember it off the top of my head. I like him. He's a good presence. But he's trying to hack the system. But what's fun there is you expect, he just needs a little time and he'll get in, but he just gets stonewalled every step of the way and he admits all I know how to do is pirate stuff and I know a little HTML. I thought I could do this and I clearly can't. And I love that the person set up to be the hacker just isn't actually very good at it and overestimated their own abilities. But then the way they actually end up resolving this is to dump, it ends up being whiskey, but just liquid on the control panel. It shorts things out and it kind of stalls Mechagodzilla. Now, the thing is, Mechagodzilla at that point is self-powered, self-sustaining, self-sufficient, and thinking for itself. So you built a machine that was capable of going almost totally autonomous and yet was capable of being glitched out if at a facility some distance away somebody accidentally spilled the coffee. Really. And again, that's the silly clashing with the tone. If the tone of the thing overall had been a little sillier, a little less dour, then honestly, I probably could have rolled with that. But it's that clash again. Oh, and another thing. If you want me, and maybe this is me, maybe other people don't have this hang up, but if you want me to have fun with giant monsters slamming each other around a city, it would really help if you didn't keep cutting to shots that reestablishes how many innocent civilians there are in the area. Like, look, there's plenty of films out there that disregard the civilian casualties, especially if it's trying to be fun. They tend to minimize that or throw some hasty line about, oh, city's already evacuated, it was fine. Yeah, right, it was. But regardless, that at least is an acknowledgement that if you're here for the monster fight, you don't want to be reminded that, hey, people are probably getting stomped underneath. But this film kept cutting to these ground level things where we see people running and screaming in the middle of the fight. So like, I keep getting taken out of the fight because you're reminding me of how many innocent people are dying, which isn't fun. That fits the tone of, say, the 2014 Godzilla, where he was more of a threat and treated like a force of nature kind of thing. Yes, in that case, it would make sense to remind me of the civilian casualties because he's a walking disaster. Here, it's supposed to be a fun monster fight. Why are you reminding me how many innocent people are dying? Because you know what? That's not fun. And it's that back and forth. It's that juxtaposition. It's that clash of the two tones of the film. It is trying to be fun, but is doing too many things that would only work if the entire thing was more serious. But too much of what's going on is too ridiculous for it to work if the whole thing's going to be treated seriously. It just kind of bottoms out. And by the end, I was just kind of, bleh. Okay. So that was a thing. That's kind of it. Interestingly, this does nothing to set up a further sequel. No post-credits, no nothing. And given that it seemed like as soon as Legendary was doing both Godzilla and Kong, the assumption, well, not the assumption, pretty much immediately as soon as they started handling both properties, it was built up. These two are going to fight. I find it interesting that they're not directly setting up anything to follow on from this. It's like they have no plan. And if this is meant to be the end game, it kind of ends the whole thing on a bit of a damp squib. Godzilla vs. Kong. Did you see it? What'd you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. I've got a Patreon. There might be a link up there, or YouTube might still be broken, and you might have to go down to the description for it. That is how I pay my bills. It is what enables this entire operation to keep going. And even if you're not able to do that, YouTube memberships are an option now. There are perks in both cases, but you also don't have to. The usual stuff, like, share, subscribe, it all helps me out, and that would be greatly appreciated, but you don't have to do that either, because at the end of the day, you're the council, I'm just running the meetings, and until next time, this council is adjourned. Happy Trans Day of Visibility.